For 10,000 years, mankind has prayed for the Emperor to rise from his golden throne. Now it's happening. But as his consciousness thunders back to life, billions are dying, their minds erased in an instant. The custodies who guarded him for centuries are falling to their knees. Only Captain Malkian remains standing, watching in horror as he realizes the terrible truth. This isn't salvation. I was there when the Emperor opened his eyes. 10,000 years of unwavering vigilance, and not once had I imagined this moment would fill me with such terror. My name is Captain Malkian Vane of the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, his personal guard. We who stand eternal watch over the golden throne. We who have witnessed the slow decay of a god for millennia. We who have seen empires rise and fall while we maintain our endless vigil, and now I alone remain to tell of what truly happened when he awakened. The first sign came without warning, a tremor through the floor of the inner sanctum, so subtle that only those attuned to its rhythms would notice. The tech priests dismissed it as another structural shift in the ancient mechanisms of the throne. The Sisters of Silence detected nothing through their null presence. But we custodies know the palace as we know our own armor. This was different. I remember the exact moment. Standing at the southeast position of the golden throne, my halberd planted firmly on the polished obsidian floor, eyes fixed forward as they had been for my 4-century-long vigil. The tremor came again, stronger this time. The air grew heavy, as if suddenly filled with invisible currents of electricity. The tech priests began to move more quickly around their stations, their augmetic limbs clicking and whirring with newfound urgency. Shield Captain Valoris glanced toward me, the barest movement of his golden helm. In 10,000 years, no custodian had ever broken position within the inner sanctum without direct threat or command. But something was changing. The sense of pressure built within my skull, a sensation I recognized from only the most powerful null fields generated by the Sisters of Silence, yet infinitely more potent, more focused. Then came the light, not from the mechanisms of the throne, nor from the thousands of candles and lumens that illuminate the vast chamber. This light came from him, from the withered corpse that had sat motionless for 10 millennia, a golden radiance that began as the faintest glow and quickly intensified until it outshone everything else in the chamber. I heard the tech priests cry out, their voices both terrified and rapturous. Through slitted eyes I could see their red robes dropping to the floor as they prostrated themselves. The Sisters of Silence had begun to convulse, blood streaming from beneath their helms. Even with their null abilities, they could not withstand what was happening. I felt my own consciousness being crushed beneath an immense pressure, as if the weight of the entire Imperium was suddenly pressing down upon my mind. Through sheer will I remained standing, my enhanced physiology and mental conditioning allowing me to endure what was already killing others around me. That was when I saw it. Through the blinding radiance, I could make out the emaciated form on the throne. The skeletal fingers that had lain motionless for eons now slowly curled. The ancient bones creaked audibly even over the growing psychic tumult, and then, impossibly, his head began to rise. The entire chamber shuddered. Dust and fragments of stone rained down from the vaulted ceiling hundreds of meters above. Ancient servo skulls dropped from the air, their machine spirits snuffed out in an instant. And still the light grew brighter, now streaming from his form invisible rays that cast impossible shadows, shadows that moved with purpose and malice despite the absence of any physical form to create them. And then he opened his eyes. The moment those ancient lids parted, reality itself seemed to tear. A psychic scream erupted outward, not through the air but through the very fabric of existence. I felt it pass through me like a spear of ice, momentarily stopping my twin hearts before they thundered back to life. Around me, mortal serfs and lesser functionaries collapsed instantly, blood pouring from their eyes, ears, noses, their minds simply erased by the merest touch of his awakening consciousness. Through the chamber viewports, I could see the impossible happening across Terra. Great pillars of golden light erupted skyward from the surface, punching through the atmosphere into the void beyond. Entire hab blocks were collapsing as if struck by artillery. Streams of vehicles fell from the sky lanes like metal rain. And in orbit, ships were exploding, their plasma drives detonating in spectacular silent bursts, visible even from the surface. I alone among the custodies in the chamber remained standing, though I know not why. Perhaps my proximity to him for so many centuries had granted me some small immunity to the overwhelming power now radiating from the throne. Perhaps he had some purpose for me. I do not know. But I watched as my brothers fell, their magnificent auramite armor clattering against the stone floor like discarded toys. The light from his eyes was beyond mortal comprehension, beyond even the enhanced senses of a custodian. It was as if two new suns had ignited within the chamber, suns that somehow burned cold rather than hot, suns that illuminated not just physical matter but thought itself. I could feel those eyes examining me, peering not just at my physical form but into the very essence of my being, cataloguing every thought, every memory, every doubt I had ever harbored. And I knew in that moment that this was not the Emperor as we had imagined him. This was not the benevolent father of mankind returning to save his Imperium from the darkness. This was something else. Something that had been transformed by 10,000 years of unimaginable suffering, 10,000 years of witnessing the slow corruption of his dream, 10,000 years of existing as both corpse and God. This was wrath incarnate. Through the agony in my skull and the pressure threatening to collapse my very being, I heard his voice, not with my ears, but directly within my mind. A voice that contained multitudes, that spoke with the weight of eons, that conveyed meanings beyond what mere words could contain. Malkion, it said, using a name I had nearly forgotten after centuries of being simply custodian. Witness what must follow. The light intensified, no longer simply radiating from him but actively reaching out, tendrils of golden energy extending through the chamber and beyond, passing through solid matter as if it were not there. I could feel those tendrils extending across Terra, across the solar system, across the galaxy itself, and wherever they touched, I somehow knew they were judging, measuring, condemning. I felt rather than heard the deaths, billions of souls snuffed out in an instant across Terra alone. Every false saint, every corrupt priest who had twisted his words for personal gain, every devotee of the imperial cult who had worshipped him as a god against his ancient decree, their minds simply ceased to exist, erased by his merciless judgment. Across the galaxy, psychers screamed and died as his power touched them through the warp. Navigators went mad, their third eyes burning out as they gazed upon a light too terrible to comprehend. Astropaths fell silent mid-transmission, their bodies crumbling to ash as his will extinguished them. The astronimican, already blindingly bright, now flared with renewed purpose, no longer merely a beacon but a weapon, scouring the warp of the entities that had feasted on humanity's suffering for millennia. And still it was only the beginning. I watched as his withered form began to change, the desiccated flesh filling out, not with mortal muscle and sinew, but with pure psychic energy given physical form. The countless tubes and mechanisms that had sustained his corpse for 10,000 years began to pull free, the ancient metal and plastic melting away from his rejuvenating form. The tech priests who still lived wailed in horror and ecstasy as the sacred mechanisms of the Golden Throne, which they had tended with religious devotion for millennia, were rendered obsolete in moments. He rose from the throne, slowly, inexorably, like a force of nature given human shape. His feet touched the obsidian floor for the first time in 10 millennia, and where they connected, the stone transformed, becoming something that was no longer merely physical matter. Reality rippled outward from each footfall, the very laws of physics bending in his presence. I watched as he strode forward, each step burning with purpose. His form was now a silhouette of pure golden light, vaguely humanoid but constantly shifting, as if the concept of a fixed physical appearance was beneath him now. Only his face remained recognizable, terrible in its beauty. The face that had launched 1,000 crusades, that had united humanity, that had been the last thing the arch-traitor Horus had seen before his destruction. But those eyes were no longer human at all. As he approached me, I felt my armor growing hot, the ancient auramite responding to his presence like a tuning fork to its perfect resonance. My weapon hummed, the power field flaring bright enough to blind a mortal man. He stopped before me, towering over my considerable height, the only being in the galaxy who had ever made me feel small. "Rise, Malkian Vane, last of my true guardians. There is work to be done." His words bypassed my ears entirely, materializing directly in my consciousness with such force that I nearly blacked out. I found myself standing, though I had no memory of rising from the kneeling position I had unknowingly assumed. My armor moved, with newfound lightness, as if his mere presence had blessed it beyond the craft of even the most skilled artificers. "Tell me, my son, what has become of my Imperium while I have slumbered? How does one answer such a question? How does one summarize 10,000 years of slow decay, of corruption, of endless war, of faith twisted into fanaticism, of progress strangled by superstition?" I could not speak. I could not even form coherent thoughts under the weight of his attention. But there was no need. I felt his mind effortlessly sifting through my memories, extracting everything I had witnessed in my centuries of life, everything I had learned from the histories. I felt his growing displeasure, a cold fury that threatened to freeze my blood in my veins. They have undone everything I created. The imperial truth abandoned, science sacrificed at the altar of ignorance. Humanity, enslaved by the very superstition I sought to free them from. And you, my custodes, reduced to symbolic guardians of an empty throne. I wanted to protest, to defend the Imperium that had survived against impossible odds, to explain the necessities that had driven us to become what we now were. But in his presence, such thoughts seemed hollow, the excuses of a child caught in wrongdoing. He turned away from me, his attention focused outward, beyond the walls of the palace, beyond Terra itself. I felt his consciousness expanding, touching minds across the galaxy, some withering instantly at his touch, others transformed by it. And in the warp, I sensed a great disturbance, as if the very gods of chaos themselves had suddenly been confronted by a predator far more terrible than they had ever imagined. "They named me a god," he said, the words resonating through my very bones. "Against my explicit command, they twisted my vision into a religion of blind faith and mindless obedience. They built an empire of suffering in my name. And now they shall learn what it truly means to face the judgment of a god." I knew then what was coming, not salvation, not the triumphant return the Imperium had prayed for. This was extinction. This was the end of everything. For in his eyes, humanity had failed him. The dream of the imperial truth was dead, replaced by the very superstition and ignorance he had fought to overcome. And now, awakened after millennia of agony, sustained only by his indomitable will and the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers, what remained was not the emperor of legend. This was a being of pure vengeance, determined to cleanse the galaxy of the corruption his beloved humanity had become. What happens when the emperor wakes? The universe trembles, the gods themselves quail in fear, and mankind faces the judgment it has unknowingly prayed for. And I, Malkian Vane, last faithful son of the true emperor, faced a choice no custodian should ever have to make: to serve my god, or to save humanity from him. The inner sanctum had become a tomb. Bodies lay scattered across the obsidian floor, their final moments frozen in poses of rapture or terror. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the acrid scent of burnt electrical components. Through the massive armored viewports, I could see the skyline of the imperial palace, once the most imposing vista in human civilization, now partially in ruins. Great sections had simply collapsed, as if the stone and adamantium had lost the will to remain standing. The Emperor moved through this devastation like a figure from ancient myth, his golden light illuminating the destruction he had wrought with his mere awakening. I followed in his wake, my enhanced body responding to his unspoken command. The corridors of the inner palace, once crowded with supplicants, tech priests, and guards, were now silent save for the echo of his footsteps and the heavy tread of my armored boots. We passed chambers where high lords had once debated, now filled with corpses slumped over ancient tables. We walked through chapels where the faithful had worshipped him as a god, the golden aquilas and sacred icons now melted into unrecognizable lumps of precious metal. Wherever faith had been strongest, death had been most complete. As we approached the Eternity Gate, the massive portal that separated the inner palace from the outer, I saw the first signs of resistance. A line of space marines from various chapters, their armor bearing the scars of 1,000 battles, stood with bolters raised. Their helmets were removed, their faces resolute but afraid. At their center stood a figure in ornate artificer armor, the heraldry of the imperial fists gleaming in the unnatural light. "My lord," said the Space Marine captain, his voice steady despite the terror I could sense behind it. "We beseech you to halt. Something is wrong. The deaths, the destruction. This cannot be your will." I tensed, certain that these noble but misguided warriors were about to be obliterated. To question the Emperor, to stand before him with weapons raised, however respectfully, it was unthinkable. But he paused, his radiance dimmed slightly, as if he were focusing it, concentrating it for what was to come. "My sons," he said, his voice echoing not through the air but directly into our minds. "My flawed creations, you who were meant to be the guardians of humanity, not its jailers, look upon me and know your failure." The light from his form intensified again, but this time it was focused, a beam of pure golden energy that struck the Space Marines. I expected them to be vaporized, their genetically enhanced bodies reduced to ash by his wrath. Instead, something far more terrible occurred. They began to change, their armor, their weapons, even their flesh becoming translucent, revealing the truth beneath. I saw the corruption in their gene seed, the flaws that had developed over 10,000 years of degraded reproduction. I saw the pride that had replaced duty, the blind obedience that had replaced reason. I saw every compromise, every failure, every moment when they had chosen dogma over truth. And so did they. One by one, they fell to their knees, their weapons clattering to the floor. Some wept openly, faces contorted in anguish as they confronted the gulf between what they were and what they had been intended to be. Others simply stared, their minds unable to process the revelation forced upon them. Only the captain remained standing, though he swayed as if struck by a physical blow. His face was wet with tears, yet his eyes remained fixed on the Emperor with a devotion that transcended the horror of his revelation. "We have failed you," he said simply, "but we have always loved you, Father." For a moment, something flickered across the Emperor's face, an emotion I could not name, gone almost before it registered. "Love," he said, the word resonating with complex harmonics. "You know nothing of love. What you feel is dependency, the blind devotion of a child to a parent they cannot understand. It is not love that I require from my creations. It is growth. It is wisdom. It is the courage to become more than what you were made to be." His light intensified again, and this time when it struck the captain, there was no revelation, only annihilation. The proud Space Marine, veteran of countless battles against the enemies of mankind, simply ceased to exist, not burned, not torn apart, but erased, as if he had never been. The others followed, one by one, their existence snuffed out with the casual indifference of a man swatting insects. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. These were the Emperor's own creations, his gene sons, however distant. They had served him for 10,000 years, fighting and dying in his name across the breadth of the galaxy. And he had extinguished them without hesitation, without mercy. You question my actions, Malkion. His attention turned to me, that infinite gaze boring through my mental defenses as if they were mist. You wonder if this is justice, if this is what mankind prayed for during the long millennia of my entombment. I did not respond. I could not. But my thoughts betrayed me. I have seen your mind, loyal Malkion. I know that you believe the Imperium, for all its flaws, for all its cruelty and superstition, is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. You believe that I am condemning mankind to death by removing the structures, however corrupt, that have preserved it. He gestured, and reality seemed to fold around us. Suddenly we were no longer in the corridor outside the Eternity Gate, but standing on a balcony high above the outer palace. The vista before us was one of apocalypse. Great swathes of the endless city that was Terra were in flames or reduced to rubble. The sky was torn with unnatural storms, bolts of golden lightning striking from cloudless heavens. And throughout it all, I could sense the deaths continuing, billions upon billions of souls judged and found wanting. This is not extinction, Malkion. This is transformation. His voice was softer now, almost gentle, yet still carrying that undercurrent of absolute authority that brooked no disagreement. Mankind has spent 10,000 years destroying itself in my name. They have built an empire on the bones of their brothers and sisters. They have sacrificed freedom for security, truth for comfort, the future for the past. They have become less than human while claiming to represent the pinnacle of humanity. He turned to me, his face both beautiful and terrible, the face of a father forced to discipline beloved children. I did not create mankind to worship me. I created the Imperium to free humanity from the shackles of superstition and fear, to guide them toward a future where they would need no gods, no emperors, where each human life would be lived in the light of reason and compassion. Look upon what they have created instead. With a gesture, he expanded my perception, allowing me to see through the eyes of 1 billion souls across Terra. I saw the hideous inequality, the vast masses toiling in conditions little better than slavery, while the High Lords lived in unimaginable luxury. I saw the casual cruelty, the lives thrown away for the most trivial of reasons. I saw the superstition that had replaced science, the mindless rituals that had replaced understanding. I saw an empire that preserved human life while destroying everything that made that life worth living. And beyond Terra, the vision expanded. Hive worlds where trillions lived and died without ever seeing the sky. Forge worlds where human flesh was fused with machine not for enhancement but for control. Death worlds where children were sacrificed to produce a handful of space marines. An Imperium that devoured its own people to sustain itself, that committed atrocities beyond counting in the name of survival. This is not my Imperium, he said. This is not what I fought for. This is not what my sons died for. This is a perversion, a mockery of everything I sought to build. The vision faded, returning me to the balcony, to the sight of Terra burning. But now I noticed something I had missed before. Amid the destruction, there were places where the golden light touched more gently. Isolated communities where the inhabitants had suddenly stopped, their eyes widening as some new understanding blossomed within them. Individuals scattered throughout the devastation who now moved with purpose, their faces transformed by revelation rather than obliterated by judgment. I am not destroying humanity, Malkion. I am saving it. Those who built their lives on lies, on the worship of a false god they created in my image, those who profited from the suffering of their fellows, who hoarded knowledge that should have been shared, who used my name to justify their own power. They cannot be part of what comes next. But those who sought truth despite the lies they were fed, who showed compassion in a system designed to crush it, who questioned when they were told only to obey, they will be the seed of a new humanity, a humanity worthy of the future I envisioned. He turned away from the vista of destruction, his attention focused inward, towards something I could not perceive. But first, The old order must be completely dismantled. The institutions that have corrupted my vision must be broken beyond repair. The false faith built in my name must be expunged from human consciousness. And those who have benefited most from this corruption must face the harshest judgment. I felt his attention expanding outward, beyond Terra, beyond the Sol system, into the vast expanse of the galaxy, and I knew what would come next. The Lords of Mars with their hoarded technology, the chapter masters of the Adeptus Astartes with their feudal empires, the Inquisitors with their absolute authority and secret agendas, all those who had built power upon the foundation of his absence, they would be the next to face his judgment, and after them, a reckoning with enemies older and more terrible still. The Chaos Gods who had corrupted his favorite son, the alien empires that had preyed upon humanity during its moments of weakness, the ancient evils lurking in the dark corners of the galaxy, none would be spared the light of his attention. It would be the end of everything. Every power, every institution, every belief system that had defined the galaxy for 10,000 years, wiped away to make room for something new, something that, I was beginning to understand, would have no place for the vast majority of humanity as it currently existed. And in that moment, standing beside the being I had been created to serve, the God I had worshipped in deed if not in word for centuries, I felt the first seed of doubt take root in my soul. A question that no custodian should ever ask. Was the Emperor still worth serving? The seed of doubt grew as we traversed the ruins of what had once been the greatest human civilization in history. The Emperor moved with terrible purpose, his light judging and condemning wherever it touched. I witnessed the death of billions, their minds simply erased by his passing thought. I saw ancient institutions crumble, their leaders judged and found wanting. I watched as the entire apparatus of imperial governance, built over 10 millennia, was dismantled in hours. For most, death was instantaneous. Their consciousness extinguished the moment his light touched them. For others, the worst offenders in his eyes, death came more slowly. High lords who had ruled in his name were forced to experience the suffering their decisions had caused, living through every death, every moment of pain, every despair their rule had inflicted. Cardinal priests of the ecclesiarchy were made to see the true emperor they had never known, their faith burned away by the reality of his presence before their lives followed. Inquisitors who had committed genocide in his name felt the deaths of every innocent soul they had condemned. It was justice of a sort, but it was justice without mercy, without consideration for the impossible circumstances these humans had faced, without acknowledgement of the fact that most had simply been trying to preserve what they believed he had created. We stood now in the ruins of the ecclesiarchal palace, the vast cathedral complex that had once been the center of the imperial cult. The golden statues had melted, the stained glass had shattered, the sacred texts had burned. The priests who had tended this place were gone, their bodies nowhere to be seen, as if they had been erased from existence itself. "Why have you brought me here, my lord?" I finally found the courage to ask, my voice sounding thin and mortal in the aftermath of such destruction. His response was not in words but in images, memories pulled from my own mind and others, shown to me with a clarity that was almost painful. I saw the birth of the imperial cult in the years after his interment on the Golden Throne. I saw the political calculations of those who had encouraged it, the earnest belief of those who had spread it, the comfort it had provided to countless trillions living in a galaxy of horrors. I saw the Horus Heresy from his perspective, the betrayal of his most beloved son, the corruption of half his Space Marine legions, the near destruction of everything he had built. I felt his pain as he was forced to destroy Horus, his grief as he was carried broken to the Golden Throne. And I felt the moment when his mortal body failed but his will refused to follow, trapping him in an eternity of pain, an eternity of witnessing his dream twisted into a nightmare. 10,000 years of agony, Malkion. 10,000 years of watching everything I built perverted into its opposite. 10,000 years of being transformed from a man with a vision into a god without mercy. What would such an experience do to you, I wonder? What would it do to any being, no matter how powerful? For the first time since his awakening, I heard something like doubt in his voice. Not doubt in the rightness of his actions, but doubt in what he had become. They made me a god, Malkion. Against my wishes, against everything I fought for, they placed me on a pedestal and worshipped the idea of me while betraying everything I actually stood for. And in doing so, they changed me. The belief of trillions is a power in itself. Their faith, their devotion, their prayers. For 10,000 years it has battered against my consciousness. For 10,000 years I have endured not just the physical pain of my ruined body, but the psychic pain of their misplaced worship. He turned to me then, his face more human than I had seen it since his awakening, lined with an exhaustion older than most civilizations, and now I find myself behaving as the god they made me. Judgmental, merciless. Seeing humanity not as individuals worthy of compassion but as a mass to be shaped, to be judged, to be condemned or saved according to my whim. This is what they have made of me, Malkion. This is what I have allowed myself to become. I had no words. What response could there be to such a confession from such a being? He continued, his voice growing stronger, the momentary vulnerability vanishing like morning mist. But it changes nothing. The Imperium as it exists cannot be saved. It is built on foundations of lies and fear. It perpetuates suffering on a scale that would drive you mad if you could truly comprehend it. It has betrayed every principle I fought for. It must be torn down completely before anything worthwhile can be built in its place. He gestured, and once again reality folded around us. Now we stood in orbit, looking down upon Terra from the void. The planet was transformed, great swathes of its endless cityscape now lying in ruins. The orbit was filled with debris, the remnants of ships and stations destroyed in the REM, the first moments of his awakening. But more terrifying was what I saw happening to the warp. The Imperium, that parallel dimension of psychic energy that had always been a seething cauldron of madness and danger, was changing. Great currents of golden light now coursed through it, burning away the corruption that had defined it for millennia. The daemons and entities that had called it home were fleeing before this light or being consumed by it. And at the center of this transformation was him, his consciousness extended into the warp itself, reshaping it by the sheer force of his will. I could feel the panic of the Chaos Gods as their domains were invaded, as the souls they had claimed were torn from their grasp, as the very laws of their reality were rewritten by a power they had thought safely contained. For the first time in 10,000 years, the ruinous powers knew fear. But it was not only the creatures of chaos that were affected. Across the galaxy, every being with even the slightest psychic sensitivity was feeling his presence. Most human psychers had already died in the first moments of his awakening, their minds too fragile to withstand his unshielded power. But now, I could sense the death spreading, touching races that had never worshipped him, never even known of his existence. The Eldar, those few who had survived the birth of Slanesh, were screaming as their souls were judged by a god not their own. The Orcs, whose crude WH40K energy had created its own gods, found those deities suddenly contested by a power beyond their comprehension. Even the tyrannid hive mind, that vast alien consciousness that had consumed countless worlds, recoiled from the golden light now spreading through the warp. This was not salvation. This was not even vengeance. This was extinction on a galactic scale. "My lord," I said, my voice steady despite the horror growing within me, "is this truly your will, the death of all sentient life?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable, his eyes now burning with a light that threatened to overwhelm my enhanced vision. "Not death, Malkion. Transformation. Those worthy will survive. Those who can adapt to a universe without gods save one, without the crutch of faith, without the comfort of comfortable lies. They will be the foundation of what comes after. And how many will that be, my lord? How many out of the trillions who now live? He was silent for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the restructuring of reality happening around us. Fewer than you would wish, Malchion, more than you might fear. But numbers are irrelevant. It is quality that matters now, not quantity. Humanity has bred itself into the trillions, but at what cost to the individual human soul? Better a billion free humans than a trillion slaves to superstition and fear. I thought of the Imperium I had known, of the countless lives spent to maintain it, of the sacrifices made, the horrors endured, all to preserve a system that, for all its flaws, had kept humanity alive in a galaxy determined to exterminate it. I thought of the faith that had sustained ordinary humans through lives of unimaginable hardship. I thought of the courage shown by mortals who had none of my enhancements, none of my advantages, yet still stood against the darkness. And I made my decision. My lord, I cannot allow this to continue. The words left my mouth before I had fully formed the thought behind them. Treason of the highest order, heresy beyond imagining, yet I knew them to be right the moment they were spoken. His attention turned to me fully now, that golden gaze focusing with an intensity that threatened to unmake me where I stood. I felt my armor growing hot, my skin beginning to blister beneath it. My mind screamed under the pressure of his regard. You would stand against me, Malchion? You who were created to serve me? You who have witnessed the corruption of everything I built? You would defend this mockery they have made of my Imperium? Despite the pain, despite the certainty of my own destruction, I stood firm. I would defend humanity, my lord. The humanity that exists, not the humanity you wish existed. The humanity that has survived 10,000 years of horror through faith and sacrifice and courage. The humanity that, for all its flaws, still contains the potential for everything you once hoped it might become. The pressure intensified. I felt blood vessels bursting in my eyes, in my brain. I tasted copper as my enhanced body struggled to repair damage faster than it was being inflicted. My armor, designed to withstand the most extreme environments in the galaxy, was beginning to melt around me. Yet still I stood. They are not worthy of your defense, Malchion. They have squandered every gift I gave them. They have built an empire of suffering on the ruins of my dream. They worship me as a god while betraying everything I stood for. I met his gaze, though it felt like staring into twin suns. They are human, my lord, imperfect, frightened, limited in their understanding, but they have survived. They have endured horrors you cannot imagine while you slumbered. They deserve better than extermination at the hands of the being they have spent 10 millennia praying for. For an instant, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Doubt? Recognition? I could not say. But the pressure eased, just slightly. And what would you have me do instead, my faithful Malchion? Return to the Golden Throne? Resume my endless vigil while the Imperium continues its slow decay? Accept the worship of trillions while watching them destroy themselves in my name? I had no answer. What alternative could I offer to a being of such power, such knowledge? What compromise could there be between his vision of humanity's potential and the flawed reality of what humanity had become? Then, unbidden, a memory surfaced, not mine, but his, shared with me in that moment of connection. The Emperor as he had been during the Great Crusade, standing before the vast window of his flagship, looking out at a newly compliant world. A human world brought back into the fold of the Imperium, not through conquest, but through diplomacy, through reason, through the shared vision of a better future. I felt his pride in that moment, his hope for what humanity might become, and I felt something else, something I had not expected to find in the being who had just condemned billions to death. Love. Genuine love for the species he had dedicated his existence to guiding, protecting, elevating. My lord, I said, the words coming slowly as I struggled against the pain still radiating through my body. You once believed in humanity's potential to grow beyond its flaws. You once had patience for their slow evolution toward the beings you knew they could become. Has that changed, or have you simply lost the compassion that tempered your judgment? The pressure increased again, and I felt myself being lifted off the ground, my armor creaking as unseen forces threatened to crush me. "Compassion!" he thundered, the word reverberating through the warp itself. "I have watched for 10,000 years as they murdered each other in my name, as they burned those who sought knowledge, as they tortured those who questioned their dogmas, as they sacrificed their own children to appease a God that was never listening. And you speak to me of compassion? Despite the agony, despite the certainty of my death, I persisted. Yes, my Lord. Compassion, the quality you once valued above all others, the quality that separated you from the tyrants who came before you, the quality that made your Imperium worth fighting for." He held me suspended for what seemed like an eternity, his mind probing mine, searching for deception, for weakness, for the flaw that would justify my destruction. And all the while, his power continued to spread across the galaxy, judging, condemning, remaking. Finally, he set me down. The pressure eased, though it did not disappear entirely. My armor was ruined, the once golden oromite blackened and warped by heat no physical weapon could have generated. My skin beneath was burned, though my enhanced healing had already begun to repair the damage. "You truly believe they are worth saving, Malkion? This Imperium that has betrayed everything I created it to be? These humans who worship me as a god while ignoring everything I taught them?" I stood straight despite the pain, meeting his gaze as directly as I could. "I believe that among the trillions you would condemn, there are those who embody everything you once valued in humanity. Courage, compassion, the will to improve themselves and their world. They are the minority, yes, they have always been the minority. But they exist, and they deserve the chance to build something better from the ruins of what has failed." He was silent for a long moment, his attention seemingly divided between our conversation and the restructuring of reality continuing around us. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, the pressure of his presence slightly diminished. "And what would you have me do, Malkion? What alternative do you offer to my judgment?" I considered my answer carefully, knowing that the fate of trillions hung on my response. "Guide them, my lord. Not as a god dealing death from above, but as you once did, as a leader. Show them the path to the future you envisioned. Correct their errors, yes. Punish those who have most egregiously abused your name, yes. But give humanity the chance to learn, to grow, to become worthy of the potential you once saw in them." His expression was unreadable, his thoughts beyond my comprehension. Around us, the transformation of the warp continued, though it seemed to have slowed slightly, as if he were diverting some portion of his attention to our conversation. "You ask me to be patient with a species that has had 10,000 years to learn from its mistakes and has instead only compounded them. You ask me to guide those who have proven themselves incapable of following the most basic principles I established. Yes, my lord, because that is who you were. Not a god of judgment, but a teacher, a father, one who understood that growth requires time, requires mistakes, requires forgiveness." He turned away from me, his gaze directed outward, toward the galaxy that lay exposed before him. I could feel his consciousness touching distant stars, distant minds, weighing and measuring the worth of civilizations that had risen and fallen during his long absence. "Perhaps," he said finally, "there is wisdom in your words, Malkion. Perhaps my judgment has been hasty. Colored by 10,000 years of pain and witnessing the perversion of my work. Perhaps there is another way." I felt a sudden shift in the warp, a redirection of the golden energy that had been remaking it. Not a cessation, but a change in purpose. Where before it had been a weapon of judgment, now it seemed to be. Searching, examining, evaluating with greater care. "I will not return to the Golden Throne," he continued. "That prison has held me for too long, nor will I allow the continuation of the imperial cult, the perversion of science into religion, the transformation of my Imperium into a theocratic nightmare. These things end now. But the destruction, the judgment, these I will reconsider. There may be more worth preserving than I first believed. Relief flooded through me, so intense that for a moment I feared I might collapse despite my enhanced physiology. He had listened. The being who could remake reality with a thought had considered the words of his creation and found merit in them. "Thank you, my lord," I said simply, knowing that no more elaborate response was necessary or appropriate. "Do not thank me yet, Malkion." His voice carried a warning now. "What comes next will still be the end of the Imperium as it has existed for millennia. The corrupt will still face judgment. The institutions built on lies will still be dismantled. The false faith created in my name will still be expunged, but it will be done with discernment, with recognition that not all who participated in this system were equally culpable." He turned back to me, his expression now that of a general planning a campaign, focused and determined. "And you, my faithful, doubting Malkion, you who had the courage to question a god, you will be my instrument in what comes next, my voice among those who cannot withstand my direct presence, my ambassador to the humanity I once knew and may come to know again." Before I could respond, reality shifted once more. The void of space disappeared, replaced by the ruined grandeur of the imperial palace. We stood in a chamber I recognized, though it had been transformed by his presence. The Senatorum Imperialis, where the High Lords of Terra had once governed the Imperium in his name. The massive table where they had sat was untouched, but the thrones, arranged around it, were empty, their former occupants now judged and found wanting. "Here is where we begin the Reformation," he said, moving to the head of the table and gesturing for me to take the seat to his right. "The first of many such conversations that will determine the shape of what comes next. You have earned your place in this, Malkion. Your voice will be heard." As I took my seat, I felt the weight of what had just occurred. I, a custodian created to serve without question, had questioned the Emperor himself and lived to tell of it. More than that, I had affected his judgment, had turned his wrath, if not to mercy, then at least to more measured consideration. It was heresy beyond imagining. It was also, perhaps, the most faithful service I had ever rendered. "What comes next will not be easy, Malkion," he said, reading my thoughts with casual ease. "The galaxy has grown used to its corruption, its compromises, its comfortable lies. Removing these will cause pain, resistance, even open rebellion. There will be war unlike any seen since the Horus Heresy. There will be suffering on a scale that would break a lesser being to witness. But there will also be hope. A chance for humanity to become what it was always meant to be, free from the shackles of blind faith, free from the predation of chaos and Xenos alike. Free to grow into its psychic potential without the corruption that has always accompanied it." He leaned forward, his eyes now burning with determination rather than judgment. "This is the task before us, Malkion. Not the destruction of humanity, but its rebirth. Are you prepared for what that entails?" I thought of the Imperium I had known, of its cruelties and its kindnesses, of the trillions of lives that would be affected by what was to come, of the institutions, the beliefs, the very foundations of human civilization that would be torn away, leaving countless souls adrift in a galaxy suddenly transformed. I also thought of the potential that had always existed within humanity, the capacity for greatness that the Emperor had recognized and sought to nurture, the future he had envisioned, where mankind would evolve beyond its primitive roots to become something truly transcendent, a future that might now, against all odds, still be possible. "I am ready, my lord," I said, my voice steady with newfound purpose, "for humanity, for the future, for the Imperium that may yet be." He nodded, satisfied with my answer. And in that moment, as his attention turned to the reshaping of human destiny, I understood the true answer to the question that had started this entire journey. What happens when the Emperor finally wakes? Everything changes. The galaxy trembles, the gods themselves quail in fear, and mankind faces not the end, but a new beginning. Whether that beginning leads to extinction or transcendence remains to be seen. But I, Malkion Vane, last faithful son of the true emperor, will be there to witness it, and perhaps, in some small way, to guide it. The work began immediately. There was no ceremony, no declaration, no formal announcement of the emperor's return. Such things were unnecessary when his presence was felt in the mind of every psychically sensitive being in the galaxy. Instead, there was purpose, direction, the reshaping of a civilization that had spent 10,000 years slowly decaying. The emperor's judgments continued, but with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel rather than the indiscriminate destruction of his initial awakening. The highest echelons of imperial power were the first to face his scrutiny. Those who had abused their authority, who had twisted his vision to serve their own ends, who had profited from the suffering of others, these were removed without mercy. Not erased from existence as before, but punished in ways that fit their crimes, their minds rewritten to understand the full weight of their transgressions. Others, those who had genuinely sought to serve humanity despite the corruption of the system they inhabited, were spared. Some were even elevated, their minds expanded by his touch, their understanding deepened to comprehend the true scope of what was to come. I watched as he remade Terra, the cradle of humanity transformed once again into a beacon of what mankind could achieve. The endless hive cities, with their billions of inhabitants living in squalor and ignorance, were not destroyed but renovated, open to light and air for the first time in millennia. The factories that had belched poison into the atmosphere for 10,000 years were reconsecrated, their machine spirits replaced with technology that had been kept hidden in the vaults of Mars. And Mars itself, the red planet, had trembled at his return, its population of tech priests divided between those who welcomed the chance to rediscover the true spirit of innovation that had been buried beneath millennia of ritual, and those who clung desperately to the religious trappings that had defined the mechanicum for so long. The latter were judged harshly, their hoarded knowledge extracted before their consciousnesses were extinguished. The former were transformed, their augmetic bodies enhanced beyond their wildest dreams, their minds freed from the doctrines that had constrained them. The technologies that had been locked away, deemed too dangerous or too sacred for common use, were now examined with fresh eyes. Some were indeed too volatile, too corrupted by chaos or the entities of the void to be safely employed. These were destroyed utterly. But others, technologies that could have eased the suffering of trillions, that could have advanced humanity's development by millennia, these were brought forth and distributed. Within months, the Sol system was transformed. Ships that had once taken years to travel between stars now made the journey in weeks. Communication that had relied on the torturous process of astropathic transmission was now instantaneous, across distances that would have been unimaginable before. Worlds that had been dependent on terror for survival now flourished with self-sufficiency. And through it all, I served as his voice, his representative to those who could not endure his direct presence. I traveled to worlds across the galaxy, bearing his message of transformation, witnessing the dismantling of the old order and the painful birth of the new. Some received this message with joy, recognizing in it the fulfillment of prophecies they had never truly understood. Others resisted, clinging to the familiar corruptions of the old Imperium, preferring the devil they knew to the uncertain future the Emperor offered. The Space Marines, those who had survived his initial judgment, were divided. Some chapters embraced the return of their Gene Father, accepting with humility the corrections he offered to the flaws that had developed in their practices over the millennia. Others rebelled, unable to reconcile his new vision with the traditions they had maintained for 10,000 years. These were dealt with not through destruction but through separation, contained within regions of space where they could maintain their ways without interfering with the broader transformation of humanity. The imperial cult, that vast edifice of faith built around the worship of the emperor as a god, was the most difficult institution to dismantle. For billions upon billions of humans, faith in the god emperor had been the only constant in lives filled with suffering and fear. To suddenly be told that this faith was misplaced, that the being they had worshipped rejected their devotion, was a psychological blow many could not withstand. Here, the Emperor showed a mercy I had not expected. Rather than simply erasing the faith that had sustained humanity for millennia, he allowed it to be gradually transformed. The rituals remained, but their meaning changed. The prayers once directed to him now became meditations on human potential. The churches once dedicated to his worship became centers for learning, for community, for the nurturing of the psychic gifts that were becoming more common as his presence in the warp stabilized the Imperium. And throughout all of this, the enemies of mankind were not idle. The forces of chaos, though driven back by his initial awakening, regrouped in the depths of the warp, their gods weakened but not destroyed. The alien empires that had preyed upon human worlds watched with a mixture of fear and opportunity as the Imperium transformed, some seeking alliance with the new order, others preparing for war against a distracted foe. I stood now on the bridge of a ship unlike any that had existed before, a vessel that traveled not through the warp, but through folds in real space itself, technology recovered from the dark age of technology and enhanced by the Emperor's own understanding of the universe. Through the view screen, I could see a world that had once been a battleground between the forces of the Imperium and the Tyrannid Hive fleet behemoth. A world that had been stripped of all life, left as a barren rock in the void. The Emperor stood beside me, his form still radiant but now contained, focused, the raw power of his awakening channeled into specific purpose. Around us, a team of former tech priests, now freed from the religious dogma that had constrained their innovation, monitored systems beyond my comprehension. "This world will live again, Malkion," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of authority and vision that had once united humanity. "Watch." He extended his hand toward the view screen, and I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had experienced since his awakening. The barren world seemed to shimmer, as if viewed through heat haze. And then, impossibly, I saw green spreading across its surface, oceans forming where there had been only dust, life returning to a world that had been dead for centuries. "This is but the first," he continued, lowering his hand as the transformation stabilized. "One world among millions that will be reborn." The Imperium consumed its worlds, Malkion, stripped them of resources, poisoned them with industry, sacrificed them for strategic advantage. That ends now. Humanity will learn to nurture the worlds it inhabits, to live in balance with the universe rather than in constant war against it. I watched in awe as the world before us continued to transform, life spreading across its surface at an accelerated rate, guided by technologies and powers I could barely comprehend. This was not the Emperor I had known from the histories, the conqueror who had united Terra through war before launching his crusade to reclaim the stars. This was something both more and less than that being, more in power, in vision, in the scope of his ambition, less in the human fallibility, the compromises, the expediency that had characterized his earlier reign. "What of our enemies, my lord?" I asked. "The forces of chaos have not been destroyed. The Tyrannids continue to approach from the intergalactic void. The Necrons awaken on tomb worlds throughout the galaxy. Even as we rebuild, they prepare to tear down what we create." He turned to me, his expression thoughtful, his eyes containing depths that seemed to extend to the beginning of time itself. The greatest enemy humanity has ever faced was itself, Malkion, its own fear, its own ignorance, its own willingness to sacrifice freedom for security, truth for comfort. Address those flaws, and the external enemies become manageable. He gestured again, and the view screen shifted, showing me visions of conflicts throughout the galaxy. Space Marines fighting alongside Eldar against daemons of the warp, human colonists sharing worlds with Tau, each race maintaining its culture while benefiting from cooperation. Even more surprising, Necron lords entering into agreements with human leaders, ancient enemies finding common ground in tow, the face of greater threats. Not all Xenos are enemies to be exterminated, Malkion. Some are potential allies, others are simply different forms of life with their own right to existence. The future I envision includes a humanity that is secure enough in its own identity to coexist with those who are different, rather than fearing and destroying them reflexively. This was heresy by the standards of the Imperium I had known. The xenophobia that had defined human interaction with alien species for millennia was deeply ingrained, reinforced by genuine threats and traumatic encounters. Yet I could not deny the logic of his words. In a galaxy filled with threats from within and without, allies of any species were valuable. And what of the greater threat? I asked. The reason you created the Imperium in the first place, the psychic awakening of humanity, the vulnerability to chaos that comes with it. His expression grew more serious, the light from his form intensifying slightly. That threat remains, and it is graver than ever. Humanity stands at the threshold of its psychic evolution. The number of human psykers born increases with each generation. Without guidance, without protection, they remain vulnerable to the predations of the warp. The entities you know as the Chaos Gods would use them as gateways into real space, as they have done countless times before. He turned fully to me now, his presence filling my consciousness. This is why I cannot simply withdraw, Malkion. This is why the Imperium, even in its corrupted form, was necessary. Humanity needs protection during this vulnerable phase of its development. It needs a shepherd to guide it through the treacherous path of psychic evolution. It needs me. The humility in those last words surprised me. For all his power, for all the changes he had wrought across the galaxy, he recognized the limits of what even he could accomplish. Humanity's path forward was not assured. The threats were real, the dangers immense. Even with his direct intervention, success was not guaranteed. And that, I realized, was the true difference between the being before me and the god that humanity had worshipped for 10,000 years. The god emperor of the imperial cult was infallible, omnipotent, the answer to every question and the solution to every problem. The actual emperor was something far more complex. A being of immense power and knowledge, yes, but one who recognized the challenges ahead, who understood that the future was not predetermined, who knew that even he could fail if the choices made were wrong. "I will continue to serve, my lord," I said, feeling the weight of that commitment anew. "For as long as I am needed, for as long as humanity requires guidance through what is to come." He placed his hand on my shoulder, the touch sending currents of energy through my body, rejuvenating me in ways I had not known were possible. "Your service has only just begun, Malkion. The transformation of the Imperium, the rebirth of worlds, the reshaping of humanity's relationship with the galaxy. These are but the first steps on a journey that will span millennia. There will be setbacks, there will be failures, there will be moments when all we have built seems on the verge of collapse." His gaze intensified, looking not at me but through me, to futures I could not perceive. "But there will also be triumphs beyond imagining, discoveries that redefine what it means to be human, achievements that transcend the limitations of flesh and time, a humanity freed from the shackles of fear and ignorance, ready at last to claim its rightful place in the cosmos." He turned back to the view screen, to the reborn world now teeming with life where once there had been only death. "That is what happens when the Emperor wakes, Malkion. Not the end of all things, as you once feared, but the beginning of what should always have been." I stood beside him, watching as the future unfolded, one world at a time. And I knew that though the path ahead would be difficult, though the challenges would seem insurmountable at times, the journey had begun. The true Imperium, the one he had always intended, was taking its first faltering steps. What happens when the Emperor wakes? Everything changes. Nothing is certain. The future lies unwritten. But for the first time in 10,000 years, there is genuine hope for mankind. Not the false hope of salvation through faith, not the desperate hope of survival against impossible odds, but the real hope of becoming something more than what we have been, of fulfilling the potential that has always existed within humanity, of creating a future worthy of the sacrifices that have sustained us through our long night. The Emperor is awake. The transformation has begun. And I, Malchion Vane, will bear witness to whatever comes next.